Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we're live on Zoom and on Facebook, and I have the pleasure of introducing you to Iris Jamahl Dunkle. Iris is the author of Charmian, Kittredge, London, Trailblazer, author, and adventurer. And I think we're in for a very interesting conversation that gets outside the bounds of our usual circumference, and that's going to make it fun. So welcome, Iris.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Let's, I want to put up a visual for our audience to see. And if you give me a moment to get that going. Are you looking at what I hope you're looking at?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So by way of introduction, Iris writes and lives in Northern California. She is an accomplished author. She's received many honors and awards. She was the 1917 to 18 Poet Laureate of Sonoma County, California. She teaches at Napa Valley College, and she is the poetry director of the Napa Valley Writers Conference. She wrote the first full-length biography on Charmian London, Jack London's wife, titled Charmian, Kittredge, London, Trailblazer, author, adventurer, which was published by the University of Oklahoma Press last month. Her biography questions and rewrites the narrative presented of Jack and Charmian London by fictional biographers like Irving Stone, by recreating Charmian's life. You say Charmian was a new woman, an author, and an adventurer whose accomplishments and disruptions history had all but forgotten. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about this very interesting woman. Who was Charmian Kittredge London, Iris?
Well, that's a very good question. It took me a book to answer it. But she was a woman who didn't live within the gender norms of her time. She was a woman who sought adventure, who was independent, who was educated, and who really wanted to travel the world.
And what were her span of years?
She was born in 1876 and died in 1955. So she lived a very long life.
A very long life. And let's tie it to you personally and how your interests developed in the life of Charmian Kittredge London. When did you just first encounter her story?
Well, it's interesting. And I love that you have the House of Happy Walls up there. You can see it's behind me right now. I'm not actually there, but I'd like to be there in spirit. I first visited Jack London State Historic Park when I was in the 6th grade on a field trip. And growing up, I had always been a writer, but I didn't really know that you could be a writer, that was a career you could go. My dad wasn't, my parents didn't go to college or anything. So it wasn't something that was like, I thought of as something I could do with my life. And so when I visited Jack London State Park, I was like, oh my gosh, you can do this? I want to travel the world and write about it. This sounds great. And the original museum that I visited, which is housed in the House of Happy Walls, which is Charmian's home that she built after Jack died, was filled with Jack's story, but there was very little about Charmian in the museum. And so I didn't know that when I was visiting Jack London State Historic Park that I was getting to know Charmian along with Jack. So it was not until years later when after I got my PhD and I started working as a professor at Napa Valley College, and I started volunteering at the park, that I rediscovered Charmian and saw that there was a huge discrepancy between the person who I, loosely got to know through Irving Stone's Sailor on Horseback and other biographies about Jack London, and the person she actually was.
So did you give tours and tell people about the life of Jack and Charmian London and decide that eventually it got to you that you decided you had a book to tell?
Well, I was actually running the book club at the time, which brought together docents from the park. And there's a really strong docent program at Jack London State Historic Park. And the docents and also people from the community they came from far and wide to go sit under the oaks and talk about different books by Jack London. And after we went through several of Jack London's books, we decided, well, let's talk about Charmian. She's written several books. She's written 4 books. Let's look at her biography about Jack London, the Book of Jack London. And so we read that together. And that was the first time I realized, I thought, oh, wow, she's actually a really interesting writer. And she clearly isn't the person that's been depicted before. And that's when I started to talk about this book and began working on it. That's when I started going down to the Huntington.
Well, your audience today is mostly people that are connected to the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. So let's start making the connection between your life and the life of Charmian Kittredge London in California and Mount Desert Island.
Excellent.
Can you tell us what our local connection is to this writer?
Definitely. So Charmian's father, Willard Kittredge, his family was from Mount Desert Island. And so he left Mount Desert Island and came to California in search of gold before he joined the Union Army and went to Salt Lake City and met Charmian's mother. And so growing up, she was, her father always talked about going back to Mount Desert Island, and he couldn't go back until much later in his life. It was actually the last big trip that he took, and he wanted desperately for her to go back as well. And it wasn't until after his death that she traveled back and visited. And finally, in 1900, she was there from 1900 to 1901, and kept a very clear diary of everything she did. And she traveled to Europe and then came back and spent some time there again. And then she again visited in 1918, shortly after Jack London died. She spent several weeks there, kind of, as part of her regrouping and becoming a widow and really finding herself again. So to her, it was very special. She was very close to her father. And so it was a place that kind of identified and defined that kind of rugged individualism that her father, who was also an entrepreneur, really represented for her.
And for our illustrations here, this is Captain Willard Kittredge. I guess he was widely known as Kit.
Yes, he went by Kit. Yes.
And many of our local audience will know the story of Dr. Kendall Kittredge, which must have been her grandfather. This kind of legendary physician on the island. This over in the upper right is the mouth of Kittredge Brook.
So cool.
And at the upstream end of this iconic spot, it opens up onto Somme Sound. Many people know this if they've been waiting at the traffic light at the brook over Kittredge Brook, sometimes also known as Babson Creek. And then this is a photograph that Charmian took on one of her visits. She identified it as West Eden, Maine. Today we call this Town Hill. And there's a sign here that says Bar Harbor 7 miles. So it's that places her on the island pretty definitively. And now, Iris, you begin your book by talking about Charmian's historical reputation and how you intend to challenge it. And you start with the story of how badly she was burned by Irving Stone, the famous novelist who wrote a biography of Jack London. What happened there?
Yeah, it's a fictional biography, just to clarify,
Okay.
which is actually written that way now when it's published, but it's still in print. So what happened, and just to go back for 1 second to Charmian's heritage, her grandparents were Benjamin and Lydia Kittredge. So in case people who are listening know who those people are, it would be great. But the way that she was depicted the way she was tricked basically by Irving Stone is really interesting. So Charmian, in my book, begins at that moment, because I thought that was the important way to tell the story, is to really set up why has her story been erased, and how do we correct it? And so he went to visit her shortly after she was in a very horrible horse accident, and she was a very active person. The horse rolled over her and she nearly died. And so she was bedridden. And she was really losing the train that went from Glen Ellen to San Francisco, which was, she didn't drive. And so that was her only way to get to San Francisco, had ended. And so she was totally isolated. And you guys won't know, but Glen Ellen is, it's far from San Francisco. And so she was isolated. He came to visit her. She was in her 60s. He was in his 30s. He seduced her. He made her feel like she was very attractive, a very fascinating writer, said he would take her out dancing, and kind of wooed her into signing away her rights to not only Jack's story, but also hers. And because she signed that document, and he quickly, once he got that, really detached from her and started, doing his own thing, and wouldn't let her advise on the book. And what he ended up publishing really made her look like a terrible person, really made her look like an airhead, even though she was college educated, made her look like she really hindered her husband's career rather than helped it. And she actually helped write some of his books. And so it was really a damning portrait of her. And so her reaction actually caused the book, the image that was put of her in the book to stick, because she was so upset by it that she burned several of her diaries. She and other documents. We don't know all of the documents that were burned. She also locked away all of her papers in the Huntington Library, and made it so that no one could visit those collections until much, much later, until after her death, and much, much later. So basically for the next 80 years, her story that was written by Irving Stone was stuck in place.
Yeah. Well, you have rewritten her life, and I wonder what she would have thought of your biography. I imagine much more pleased.
That was the best compliment I've gotten on this book is from a really renowned London scholar named Earl Labor. And he said, Iris, I think you wrote the biography that Charmian would have wanted. And that was very touching.
Well, good. And so tell us about their relationship. Just framing this up, Jack London lived from 1876 to 1916, dying at age 40. Charmian was a few years older, and she lived on well past that to 1955, 83 years. So she and Jack London were married for 11 years, and of her 83. So she had a big life outside of Jack London, but clearly he was a tremendous influence on her life and its trajectory. So tell us about their relationship.
Well, they met in 1900. And so they knew each other for 16 years, and they began seeing each other in 1802. So that's, they did have more than 11 years together, but okay. It was definitely what brought them together was not only a physical attraction, but also an intellectual attraction. Jack London had one of those like really alive minds that was constantly intellectually curious. And Charmian was able to engage in that curiosity and had the same kind of curiosity. And so they would discuss, they'd be reading the same books and discussing them. He would be writing and discussing his writing with her. And they both really loved to travel. They had a very intimate and very really interesting relationship. That was very intense through the time that they were together.
And you had access to their love letters, to her diaries. You really were able to look into their intimate life. And so even after she burned a bunch of her records, you still had more. She must have been a prodigious writer to put out so much material.
Yes, well, it was lucky for me that she kept a diary from most of her life, and kept track of everything. Some things were a little embarrassing to read, but definitely every detail of her life was recorded. And she also wrote a lot of letters. They wrote a lot of love letters. And many of those early love letters, some of them were censored. So if you look at like the collected letters of Jack London, the letters aren't accurate because they were both very serious about keeping the story of their early affair buried, because I mean, it's known that they had an affair while Jack London was still married, but they actually had an affair much earlier than has even been disclosed.
Okay.
And also like the fact that they were together when he was in Korea, when he was still married, and just a lot of these little details. I was able to recover those letters from collectors. There's a lot of collectors who Jack London paraphernalia is very popular and amongst collectors, and some of those collections were made available to me. And so I was able to fill in kind of the gaps that were in those letters that were collected and make sense of some of these stories, which was really kind of shocking.
Wow. So, and as you said, their relationship was travel played a big part in their relationship, and the ocean adventures like aboard the Snark and the Dirigo. The Dirigo would be a familiar name to Maine, the Maine audience. That's the Maine state motto. I don't know if there was a connection there, but tell us about their travel together.
Definitely. Yeah, and there is a connection. The Seawall ships of steel is do you know the Seawall ships at all?
I'm not familiar with it. There's a local
I
camp
think
here called Seawall.
I think they were made in Maine. I think that's where the company is from, the Seawall family. But anyways, their love of travel is something that they shared since the early days of their relationship. They would sit and dream about going on this world tour on a little tiny boat, which when Charmian was in Mount Desert Island the first time, she read Joshua Slocum's Sailing Alone Around the World. And that was a bestseller at that time. And she got this dream in her mind of traveling the world in a small boat. She didn't want to go alone, though. She wanted to go with Jack London when she met him. And he also was thrilled about that. And so he and she started planning this journey. And in 1907, after many delays, they were able to begin sailing around the world on a small yacht called the Snark.
And their journey, their preparation was interrupted. They were eyewitnesses to the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was, those of us that live in the Bay Area, this is one of the most tragic events that's happened in our area. So in 1906, there was a horrible earthquake, unprecedented, that destroyed most of San Francisco. And Jack and Charmian were in Glen Ellen at the time, and they at a place called Wake Robin Lodge. And they woke up from the earthquake. It shook them out of bed. They went outside, and the earth was still waving. And they immediately got on horseback and went to the top of Sonoma Mountain, which is the peak, that one of the highest peaks in the area, and they could see all the way to San Francisco, which was clearly on fire. It was a huge city on fire. And they looked to the right, they saw Santa Rosa, which was the closest town, which was also on fire. And so they immediately made sure all their people in Glen Ellen were okay, and then headed straight to the city to get the story. They were concerned about their loved ones who lived in the city, but more importantly, they wanted to see this tragedy unfolding and write about it. And they both did. Jack's essay about it is haunting even to read today. And I still teach it in my classes because it's such a good account of something like this. To him, it looked like the end of the world, because you've got these people with these giant steamer trunks, like San Francisco is like this, all the hills, and people are pushing them up the hills, and all of a sudden a fire will start coming down, and they'll have to turn around and push it up another hill. It was like some Scythian, nightmare. And so he wrote about that, and Charmian also wrote about the experience, and it was something that to them was haunted them to the end of their days. It was something that was the scariest thing they ever saw.
Well, their story is marked by disasters of many kinds and illness, and yet they had this incredibly dynamic life. And the fire plays a part at several points in their story. Can you talk about that?
Definitely. So fire is something that growing up in Northern California, it's something, wildfire is something we are always afraid of here because it's so frequent, especially now. This photo especially is one of my favorites of Charmian. It shows her in the 1940s in the ruins of Wolf House. And Wolf House is the mansion that she and Jack built together as their dream home that burned to the ground just a few weeks before they were going to move in. But I love this picture of her smiling at the edge of these ruins. And you can still visit these ruins today. The house was never rebuilt. But Charmian experienced fire many other times in her life. When she was young, her father, Kit, he started working at a hotel in Petaluma, which is a town north of San Francisco. And he ran a hotel called the American Hotel there. They actually ran it as a family business, and it was one of their happiest times as a family. And unfortunately, there was a fire that spread up the street and burned the hotel to the ground. And so their family lost everything. And it actually was the last time before her mother got sick and died when she was 6 years old. And so that trauma was there from the start. And there were a lot of times on their property when fire threatened them. So when she built the house of Happy Walls behind me, she built it so that it would, quote, never burn. That was her number one priority. So it's solid as a rock, literally. It's made out of rocks that are giant. And the door, like I was there yesterday and closing it takes like all of your strength. It's really, really solid. And it's made of something like iron. It's incredible.
And you told me in our conversation before we went on air that all the collections have been safely stored away because of the fire danger in California.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys have seen in the news where you live,
yeah.
but for the last 3 years, Northern California suffered horrible wildfires, and our most recent one, the Glass Fire, threatened Jack London State Historic Park. And so at the time, the state park system comes in and boxes everything up and puts it in a warehouse in Sacramento. And so I was there at the museum yesterday doing a shoot for a newspaper article, and it's totally empty. There's no artifacts, but it's still beautiful.
Well, Jack London couldn't have been easy to live with. He was a very difficult husband. Can you give us some insight into how Charmian handled that relationship?
Certainly. She was really good with Jack London. So Jack London was a very talented writer. He was really charismatic and filled with energy. But he also loved to drink, and he loved the women, and he also smoked a lot of cigarettes, at least I think 4 packs of Lucky Strikes unfiltered a day, and when they were packs of 10. But his lifestyle wasn't exactly healthy. He was sickly. He got sick a lot. And he had these moods that he would go through. I don't know exactly what caused that, but Charmian was really good dealing with the ups and downs of his moods, and including, like, when he finished a novel, he was so depressed because it was done, and she would lift him up. And it must have been exhausting, to really kind of ride the waves of his personality. And at times that started as soon as and Charmian was very independent at the beginning of her life. The first part of their marriage, she was just 100% there for him. And then after the Snark journey, she really started to realize that she wanted to be a writer. She wanted to have her own independence again, because she was so independent before. And the more she moved towards that independence, the more Jack would push back. And it definitely caused some friction in their marriage.
Well, tell us about her life as a writer then. How did she distinguish herself as a writer apart from Jack?
Well, before she met Jack, she was already publishing articles in the Overland Monthly, which is one of the famous journals from the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. But in her aunt, Ninetta Ames, Netta was an editor and worked for it. And so she was part of this Overland Monthly crowd before she met Jack. But then she put that aside for a while. And then when they were going on their Snark journey, which was their they took a small boat through the South Seas, and they were intending on going for a 7-year journey, only ended up going for 3 because Jack got very, very sick, and Charmian got sick as well. So they had to cut it short. But the goal during that journey was that she was going to write a log of their journey, a daily log. And what began as kind of a small project became something that was all consuming to her. And she would, she read all these books and really focused on the people writing about the areas where they were visiting. And she really built to write a really interesting story about a woman traveling through the South Seas in a time when that was unheard of, that a woman would make that kind of journey. There were just a few other accounts like hers that had been written before. And so that was her first book. And then in 1918, she wrote a book about her husband, the Book of Jack London. She also wrote 2 books about Hawaii, Our Hawaii, and then Our Hawaii Islands and Islanders. And then she wrote all kinds of articles, dozens and dozens of articles. She would cover the World Fair. She wrote about George Sterling, who is a poet from the Bay Area, who was Jack London's best friend, who committed suicide and really caused this horrible loss in the community. She covered a huge breadth of topics, and really, really enjoyed the life of being a writer.
Well, there's a spicy detail we want to get to. Tell us about her affair with Harry Houdini.
Well, it wouldn't be an interview about Charmian if this question did not come up. It's actually I love to talk about it because it's something that does need to be clarified, because who wouldn't be excited about the detail that someone had an affair with Harry Houdini? I mean, it's really interesting. But what happened was they met the Houdinis in 1915, I believe. They were in Oakland. He had a performance, and Jack and Charmian went to see it. And Jack loved it so much that they went back like several times, and then befriended the Houdinis, and they all had Thanksgiving together and kept in contact. And then shortly later, Jack London died, and Houdini sent a letter to Charmian with his condolences. Then she traveled to New York and let Houdini know, because he was doing a show there. She's like, "Oh, I'm going to be coming to New York." And he's like, "Oh, well, you've got to come to the show." And so he sent her tickets, and she got all fancy and went to the show and sat in the front row. And afterwards, she met him in his dressing room, and he was like, "Oh, we have to go to dinner with my wife." And she was like, "Okay, whatever." And so they did. And slowly the wife stopped coming, and they started having a pretty intense affair for several weeks while Charmian stayed in New York. She was working with publishers, getting her book established, and working on the rights and to all of Jack's books, which were they were being contested. So she was doing a lot of hard work. And while she was doing that, she definitely was engaged in this affair. But then Harry Houdini got really, really attached to her very fast. And Charmian had spent so many years in a marriage with someone who was really intense, that she left New York and went up to Mount Desert Island, spent time with her family, and was like, "What am I doing?" And came back and broke up with him. And they never really saw each other again. But she did mourn when he died several years later.
Well, our half hour goes by all too fast. I'd like to hang out for a couple more minutes, though, if our viewers have any questions or comments they'd like to add. If you're watching on Zoom, put a note in the Q&A function or chat. And if you're watching on Facebook, please send us a comment. Maureen Fournier, you've raised your hand. Tell me what your question is on in a comment on Facebook, if you could, please. And while we're gathering those questions, can you bring us towards the end of her life? Tell us about her final decades. I know it's a big part of the story, but could you give us some of the highlights of the her later years?
Definitely. This picture here is her seated at her desk in the House of Happy Walls, and she's working on the log of the Dirigo. Now, the log of the Dirigo was a log that would have been like the log of the Snark. Only it was about their journey on the Dirigo, which is a three-masted Seawell ship of steel that went from Baltimore around Cape Horn to Seattle. And she was determined to write this book, and unfortunately, she never finished it before she became ill at the end of her life. But I think what's important to note at the end of her life was that she was very productive. From the time that Jack died, she had to keep the ranch afloat, so that the property that they lived on was not paid off, and the Depression had hit, and she and Jack's stepsister Eliza kept the ranch running. They also kept all of Jack's books in print. The reason why Jack London's books have been translated into 52 languages is because of the work that Charmian did, traveling all over the world and establishing his work in all parts of the globe. And she was also writing, like, very, very intensely. She was very focused on her life as a writer.
Well, Maureen Fournier, I got to your question, and she asked if there are other photos of Mount Desert Island, and the answer is, oh, yes, there are. And maybe, Iris, what we can do is put the address that you sent me at the Huntington Library.
Oh, yeah.
So we can so we can invite people to have a look at those images. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I'll send you the link.
Here's a scene that is familiar to MDI people. There's Acadia Mountain scene from Soames Pond. This could be almost anywhere on the island. Now, no doubt, a hardtop road with a double yellow line. And here is what she calls the toll path in Bar Harbor. I think today we would call this the ocean path. Iris Ron Beard, very knowledgeable fellow from here, points out that the shipbuilding company is probably not Seawall, but probably Sewall.
Oh, thank you.
Sewall.
Thank you for that correction.
Yeah, very prominent firm here, involved in a lot of different enterprises.
Wow, I stand corrected. Thank you. I've been mispronouncing that for years.
Yeah, me too. And Rick Wheeler, he asks, let me get to your question, Rick. What do you think Charmian would say were the biggest misconceptions about Jack London and about her?
Well, I think, I don't know that she would be focused on saying this, but the biggest misconception that I discovered is that she wasn't just his secretary. She actually helped write many of his books. And I think that's the thing that they didn't say, and that she was right there with him doing all these adventures, only he didn't document that because it didn't, at that time period, if Jack would have had his wife surfing with him in Hawaii, it wouldn't have been as popular a story. And so they were just marketing it the way that it would sell. And so I feel like correcting that would have been important to her, that at the end of the end of her life, she got some credit for the work she did in sculpting many of Jack London's books.
Well, Iris, it's been such a pleasure reading your book and talking with you. And we've put we're going to put the link to your book in the notes here. Oh, it is. Yeah, I'm going to copy this, and
I'll put it there if you want.
Oh, you can do it too?
Yeah.
Yes, you've got it. Okay, so
there.
you can viewers, you can buy this book on Amazon, or if you want to make it really special, you can get it from Iris, and she will sign it for you. So there's her communication. There's her contact information. Well, I think that's it. Iris, thanks so much for joining us. I'm glad you reached out to us and we made this connection, congratulations on your book, and thank you for saving this part of history that we didn't know about.
Oh, my pleasure. It was really nice to talk with you and to learn more about this place that I want to visit. And just if you have any questions about the book, the PayPal email that you see there is my email. You can just send me your questions directly via email.
Great, and I hope you come see us. I recommend, highly recommend September. The weather's beautiful and all the bugs are gone.
That sounds perfect. I will definitely come some September when we aren't in pandemic.
Good, good. Well, to our audience, we have a very interesting presentation next week too. Karen Sieber of the University of Maine is going to talk to us about the Red Summer. That was a summer of tremendous disruption in racial relations in the United States, some of which affected the University of Maine. And I think you'll find it very revealing. We'll put some information out there in advance, but don't miss that episode of Chebacco Chats next week. So for now, take care, everyone. We'll see you next week. Iris, thanks so much.
My pleasure. And someone had said in the notes that they couldn't actually see the link. I just repasted it so they can. So Linda, you can now see the link. Sorry about that.
Yes, if anybody else wants any more information, easy enough to track us down.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, bye everybody.